First impressions are important, especially when it comes to deciding which TV show you're going to be spending the next couple weeks, months, or years of your life watching. Which is exactly why pilot episodes of TV shows are of the utmost importance. We've all had experiences where friends, family, coworkers, classmates, whoever else have told us to watch a certain show, so you give it a try, but the first episode just doesn't really capture you the way that you wanted it to. And if you didn't like the first episode, you immediately wonder how long, if at all, it's going to take for you to actually enjoy the show. And with the introduction of streaming and shows that are released seasons at a time, the art of the pilot episode has kind of been lost. Even if they don't release the season all at once, they usually have like 2 or 3 episode premieres, which essentially just means that the pilot episode doesn't have to do its job because you can already click next episode. A pilot episode is supposed to do 3 things. Number 1, introduce the world and the characters. Number 2, introduce a problem. And most importantly is number 3, leave you wanting more. Today I have a list of 8 pilot episodes that achieved these 3 things perfectly. Are these the bona fide greatest pilot episodes of all time? No, they're not. This is my list, and I encourage you to tell me more great pilot episodes in the comments that I left off this list. And just because a show has a great pilot episode doesn't necessarily mean that the overall TV show is great. In most cases it does, but sometimes the pilot is the high point of the series. And vice versa, sometimes a show will have a terrible pilot but end up being a great series. My favorite TV show of all time is a show called Dark, but the pilot episode reads like a ripoff of Stranger Things, so it's not on this list. There's going to be spoilers in this video for all of these pilot episodes that I'm talking about, but nothing past that, so if you've never seen the show that I'm talking about, add the show to your list and just skip ahead to the next one. With all that out of the way, let's get into 8 of the greatest pilot episodes ever made. Let's start off with an episode that is always brought up in these conversations, and that's the pilot episode of Lost, titled, well, Pilot, Parts 1 and 2. Okay, I know that I said that when there's going to be more than one episode, it means that the pilot didn't really do its job, but even if we're just going off of Pilot Part 1, it would still make this list. The pilot episode of Lost has one of the most captivating openings of all time. It drops you right in just a few moments after the plane crashes, and we follow this unnamed guy.
What's your name? Jack!
Okay, we follow Jack going around helping as many people as he can. The crash site is basically a minefield of explosions and debris flying around everywhere, and this doctor has to try and help people who are injured, a pregnant woman, try to perform CPR, and keep his cool all at the same time. This is a great scene on its own, but it's even better upon rewatch, seeing all the side characters and what they're doing, and how this moment is revisited many times later on, but from different perspectives. When things calm down, we get some more intimate character moments, some foreshadowing of the future of the show, and of course, a reveal that these people aren't alone on the island. And that's Pilot Part 1. Part 2 involves a mission to go and get to the front of the plane and find, well, the pilot. We learn more about the characters and leave on yet another cliffhanger. So this pilot achieved everything that it needed to, and it excelled in all 3 phases. It introduces the world that we now live in, a great majority of the characters, even if it's just surface level introductions. The problem is pretty clear from the get-go, and both of these end on a cliffhanger that leaves us wanting answers. This is a textbook pilot episode of television that leads us into one of the greatest series ever made, and yes, I stand by that, all 6 seasons of the show are amazing. Argue with a wall. If you've been around this channel for a while, you'll know that I'm a big defender of The Walking Dead. Even the later seasons and the spin-offs, I know that's a pretty unpopular opinion with the majority of people, but anybody who's ever watched the show can agree that the pilot episode did its job. We start off the episode in the apocalypse with Sheriff's Deputy Rick Grimes seeing just how different things are from our world. He's trying to get some gas when he comes across a little girl who also just happens to be a zombie. And a zombie that would break all the rules for canon after this season, but that's besides the point. This opening shows us visually how different this world is, but also how brutal and unforgiving this series will end up being. We then contrast this scene to what it was like before the apocalypse, in what seems like a pretty normal day, until Rick and Shane get a call about a high-speed chase. They go, stop it, but Rick ends up shot and this places him into a coma. A coma that takes us into the apocalypse. Being right there with Rick as we learn and see the apocalypse for the first time is horrific and disturbing, and we really feel for this man who just wants to see his family, who are more than likely already dead. The rest of the pilot introduces us to Morgan and his son Dwayne, and Morgan would go on to be a very important character in this series and this universe in general, for better or worse, but this episode is highly emotional and allows us to care for these characters just a few minutes after we meet them. It's easy to root for good people in an apocalyptic story, and that's who these two men are at the start of this apocalypse. As the episode goes on, we get to see more of the world, other survivors, including Rick's family and his best friend Shane, who are still together and closer than ever. The end of the episode leaves us on a cliffhanger, a bit of a hopeful one, but we have no clue how Rick is going to get out of the situation that he's gotten himself into. So this pilot, of course, introduces us to Rick and Shane, briefly Lori and Carl, but of course Morgan, who actually doesn't appear for the rest of the season, or even the season after, but trust me, he's still an important character. There's two problems set up in this episode. Of course, there's the whole zombie apocalypse thing, but there's also the fact that Rick's best friend and Rick's wife are now together under the impression that Rick is dead. This is really the core focus of the story going forward and how it's dealt with and the consequences for that, but this episode gets you interested to see how that's going to play out, so in that sense it leaves you wanting more. But we also want to see how Rick gets out of the tank and who was on the radio helping him. But mostly, what I'm wondering is how bad it must smell during the zombie apocalypse, because smelling good is probably not at the top of their priority list. I mean, just look at Rick right here. The inside of this tank must smell horrible. But we're not in the zombie apocalypse, and that's exactly why I like to get my fragrances from Scentbird. If you're anything like me, you probably found the cheapest fragrance you could years ago and have just been using that until it runs out, so that way you can buy another cheap fragrance. Well, you can change that, just like I did, and get some top-of-the-line colognes like this Versace Eros that I've been using whenever I leave the house. You really don't know how big a difference wearing a good cologne is until you start wearing a good cologne. I've been getting compliments left and right, which only makes me wonder why I didn't do this sooner, and also how bad I must have smelled before. Scentbird offers a wide variety of fragrances from all the brands you've heard of but never wanted to buy from because they're so expensive, like Versace and Prada. You can mix and match whichever fragrances you want without paying the full price for the larger bottles. Each of these fragrances are perfectly sized to carry around in your pocket, purse, backpack, lunchbox, you name it. When it comes to buying expensive colognes online, you're kind of taking a risk because you don't really know what it's going to smell like, and if you're like me and don't like going to the mall to sniff every scent, Scentbird is a great alternative. So you're not only saving a ton of money, but there's no risk because you can just swap out the fragrances every month. So if you want to try Scentbird, you're in luck. You can use the code Typewriter or scan the QR code or use the link at the top of the description to get a whopping 55% off your first order, meaning you only pay $8. And trust me, this stuff really works. Thanks to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the smelly people. With such a flawless pilot, I'm sure that the rest of the series will keep the same momentum and writing, and we'll get a few good seasons of television before the series ends. That's what's gonna happen, right? Also, special shout out to the first episode of The Ones Who Live, not really a pilot episode, but one of the best episodes in the entire universe of the series. This is one that I'm not sure is an opinion shared by everybody, but I've also been rewatching the show and trying to look at it from a more analytical point of view, and in doing so, I actually think that the pilot episode, titled Winter is Coming, definitely meets the criteria for this list. A big part of the story in Game of Thrones is mystery. All kinds of mystery, and that's definitely present in this episode. We start off the episode with a glimpse at the White Walkers, hear about how they've been gone for thousands of years and how the guy who saw them just must have been crazy, but we know this isn't true. There's the death of Jon Arryn and what's actually happened to him, this feud between the Starks and Lannisters that we get very little context for. There's just so much going on in this episode, and it doesn't really ease you into anything at all. You're just kind of dropped into the middle of the story, and you pick things up as they go along. For that reason, I don't think this will be an episode that everybody agrees with me on. Yes, it's a great episode, but what makes it a good pilot episode? Well, when you break it down, this episode centers on Bran. We're with him as he's training, as he goes out in the world, as he's climbing around. A lot of this world that we're viewing for the first time, we're viewing with Bran because he's never seen this stuff either. Of course, there's other points of view, but it really seems like Bran would be our central main character because that's how the episode is structured. So when the episode ends with him getting pushed out of a tower, it's shocking because we've kind of been conditioned in fantasy storytelling to know who the protagonist is by them discovering the world along with the audience. Game of Thrones broke that trend here because Bran wasn't really the main character, and it would continue breaking trends in fantasy for subsequent seasons. For a story as massive and complex as Game of Thrones, the introduction of the series was incredibly important, because too much information, especially in a fantasy world, thrown at you at once can be incredibly overwhelming. So Game of Thrones doesn't really do that. It sets up a few intriguing plot threads, a few different problems, highlights a few different characters, shocks you with its brutality at the end of the episode, but overall leaves a lot of different mysterious threads dangling to pique your interest. Next up is a show that I have been absolutely obsessed with for about 2 years now, and I am still anxiously awaiting the second season. If you've been around the channel, you know that I'm a sucker for a good mystery, and Severance is not only a good mystery show, it's the best mystery show since Lost, and you can quote me on that. Seeing as how Lost is on this list, it's only fitting that Severance would also make its way here. The first episode of Severance is a masterclass in the show don't tell rule. We open the series with Helly waking up inside of Lumen for the first time. She has a reaction that all of us would probably have and are having as audience members. You wake up in a strange room, you'd probably think you've been kidnapped or something. And that's what we think until Helly realizes that she doesn't have any memories about anything whatsoever. We then switch over to Adam Scott's character, Mark. We see what Mark's daily routine is like, both inside and outside of work, but this is especially important for his work routine because that's what the whole show is about. When you go into work, your brain is severed, so you only know what your work life is like, and when you go home, you don't know what your work life is like, so you can just enjoy your off time. At the Lumen offices, we get to see just how much of a labyrinth this place is, we see how close the characters are at work, and have so many different mysterious questions, some of which would be answered in this season, most of which aren't. This episode not only illustrates this rule to perfection without needing to actually explain it, but if you still don't quite understand it, towards the end of the episode they have a conversation about it for those that didn't quite catch on to the concept, but the scene is really here to give Mark an opportunity to explain why he went through this process and show us how broken he truly is. The innies and outies, as they call them, are two very different people, and that's true for everybody, including Mark's neighbor Mrs. Selvig, who also happens to be Mark's boss inside Lumen, except she might not be so different after all. This episode, just like Winter is Coming, offers up so many different questions. The atmosphere is eerie and there's several different problems introduced, like Mark being promoted because of Petey leaving, Helly's arrival, Mark's outside life, and then it leaves us wanting more with the Cabal/Mrs. Selvig reveal. I know this is probably a show not a ton of you have seen, and if you haven't seen it, I didn't spoil anything outside of the first episode, and I urge you very heavily to go and check this out to prepare for Season 2. And then check out my video on theories for Season 2. I was a little bit late to the hype surrounding The Boys. I was able to binge through the first 2 seasons and then watch seasons 3 and 4 as they were coming out, but this is the perfect example of a show selling me on the pilot episode. I wasn't really too sure what to expect from this show because at the time, I didn't know it was a commentary/parody on superheroes. I really thought this was just a straight up ripoff of Marvel and DC characters, and that quickly faded just a few minutes into the episode. I can't exactly show the scene that I'm talking about here, but let's just say that something happens a few minutes into the episode that really separates this from other superhero shows and movies. If you know, you know. But after the initial shock of the episode, we follow around two central characters, both of them going on their own separate hero's journey. That's Huey and Starlight. The Starlight portion of the episode feels incredibly heavy-handed, and I thought it was a bit cheesy at first until I realized that was the entire point. She's getting the job of her dreams, she's famous and has fans, and gets to join the equivalent of the Justice League, filled with all these heroes that she's looked up to her whole life, until she realizes this is not at all the job she expected it to be, and these heroes aren't the people that she thought they were. Huey's storyline is what really sold me on the premise of the show. First off, we feel awful about the things that he's gone through in the opening minutes, so when he gets visited by some twisted mentor figure who tells him that all superheroes are dangerous people, except Homelander, who's actually a saint, and how he has a team of people that's hunting them down, we want Huey to join him and take his revenge. He, of course, refuses at first until he accepts the whole hero's journey thing, but what I absolutely loved about this episode is how it executes a perfect plant and payoff. Early on in the episode, Huey is talking with a customer about her purchase and how she needs a carbon HDMI cable because the carbon is really conductive. This all sounds like technical Geek Squad jargon until this same cable is used later on in the episode to subdue translucent. Huey used his geek technical jargon skills to take down a freaking soup, something that Butcher couldn't do alone because of his knowledge of all this geek stuff, but it's also said while translucent is on Jimmy Fallon that his skin is made of carbon. Not only is this a win for technical geeks like Huey, but another reason why this episode is so great is because both of these storylines intersect and they talk about their issues, both of them going through hard times and able to relate to one another and also hit it off, which is another huge win for geeks like Huey. So it introduces the world and characters very well, the problem, but how does it leave us wanting more? Well, Butcher said that Homelander is a saint, but at the end of the episode we learn that that very much isn't true. And later on we learn, if anything, it's the exact opposite. This is one that a lot of people were probably waiting to see on this list, and I know a lot of people have been asking me to cover this show, so here you go. I think most people are generally aware of this show and its legacy, but if you aren't, the short version is that a high school chemistry teacher who gets cancer wants to make money for his family when he's gone, so he turns to making meth and gets involved in a lot of bad stuff. So like most pilot episodes, you have to start things off fast. You have to instantly capture the attention of the viewer, and the best way to do that is to start off with a scene right in the action. Now, it's kind of hard to start there unless you're a show like Lost, so they usually prefer to show an action-packed scene and then cut back to some form of time earlier. The technical, pretentious term for starting the story this way is in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. A lot of stories do this, particularly TV show pilots. Everybody talks about having TikTok brains with no attention spans, but this device has been used a number of times before TikTok even existed, so our brains were already rotted far beforehand. But TikTok certainly hasn't helped. The pilot episode of Breaking Bad perfectly illustrates the dull and monotonous life that Walter White lives, how underestimated and underappreciated he is, and how high schoolers are the absolute worst people on the planet. But it's because of this tedious life that he lives that we understand the decisions and risks that he takes. And not to get too far into spoiler territory, but if you look at Walter White's entire character arc throughout the series, his arc in this episode actually mirrors that pretty perfectly. Maybe I'll go into that another time, maybe not. This episode is also written flawlessly. We see a problem, and Walt comes up with a solution. Sometimes the solutions involve how incredibly smart he is, sometimes it's just how fed up he is with life. Regardless, it makes it very easy to root for Walter. Similarly to The Boys, this episode has excellent plant and payoffs, with Walt knowing how the chemical reaction to meth can go wrong, and using that to his advantage at the end of the episode. Not only is the plot perfect, but the dialogue is extremely solid, just like it is for the rest of the series. We're introduced to our primary characters in this episode, of course Walt, but there's also Skyler, Walt Jr., Jesse, and Hank. We see all of their relationships with Walt and how all of them underestimate and undervalue him. We then see the problem, which is how much Walt and his family are struggling financially, and as for the wanting to see more aspect, well, it kind of depends on how much you cared about the episode in general. This episode is almost like a short movie in and of itself because it tells a mostly complete story. There's no cliffhanger or anything like that to the episode, but it's a great episode, and if you want to see more great episodes, well then you keep watching the show. Going back to talking about mystery and another recent show, let's talk about Only Murders in the Building. Like I said earlier, I'm a sucker for mystery, even not so great mystery, and for a little bit into this episode I was like, yeah, this probably isn't going to be great, but I dig the vibes, I like the music, and I like the actors, so I'll give it a shot. We start off with the typical intriguing scene in the future and then cut back to 2 months earlier, where 3 characters don't know each other and are little more than strangers. We learn a bit about both Steve Martin and Martin Short's characters, but very little about Selena Gomez's character, Mabel. After a fire alarm and their building goes off, they all evacuate and find common ground in this true crime podcast that they all listen to. Which is honestly a cool little commentary about how different stories and different pieces of media can bring people together. But anyways, there's a murder in the building of the guy that they all saw, and since they're all obsessed with this true crime podcast, they of course want to investigate further. Through these scenes, we learn more about each of them, the lives they live, the secrets they keep, and how truly alone each of them are. When they band together to make their own podcast, because this guy's death has a big question mark around it, it seems like a pretty interesting setup, but what really makes this episode for me and makes me want to put it on this list is the twist at the end of the episode. I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but it was truly something that I didn't see coming, even though there's proper setup for it, and it completes the 3 points of criteria I have for this list. I remember watching the first 3 seasons of the show. I haven't seen the 4th one, and apparently there's going to be a 5th. I mean, how many more murders can happen in this building before everybody moves out? Last but not least is a show that came out during the golden age of pilots, and that's Heroes. Heroes came out in the age before Netflix and streaming, so each and every one of these shows that came out on cable had to have a strong pilot, because if it didn't, the show might not be picked up whatsoever. The same was true for Lost, but Lost has gone on to live a much longer life than Heroes has. So for the uninitiated, Heroes is absolutely incredible. As you can probably guess, Heroes is about people with superpowers, and this was in the age before superhero parody/commentary shows were popular. This was a drama involving a lot of different characters with a lot of different cultures and background. Quite honestly, if this show came out now, I think it would be far more successful. The show has an excellent concept, great actors, one of the most unique soundtracks I've ever heard, and it's all around just one of my favorite shows that doesn't get nearly the love and attention it deserves. But anyways, this pilot episode has stuck out to me as one of the best pilots of any show ever. A lot of this episode is introducing people. In fact, that's 90% of the episode, and we see all kinds of different powers, from the usual ones like healing, flight, stopping time, to other more unique ones like a double version of yourself in a mirror and painting the future. Then there's the non-superhero stuff, like Mohinder over in India, who learns about his father's death and how he thinks it wasn't an accident because of all of his father's research. But most interestingly is the character of Peter Petrelli. While he's convinced he has superpowers and he can't quite use them, everyone else in the episode is either very well acquainted with their powers or learning how to harness them. Peter is the protagonist and the most curious about his powers, yet by the end of the episode, he's the only one that doesn't actually use them, to the point where we aren't actually sure if he has them. Because the show has such a large cast, most of the episode goes to introducing them, but we're introduced to the problem when we meet the painter Isaac Mendez. Isaac can see the future, and he ends up painting a bomb going off in New York City. We see different storylines intersecting, different relationships and characters meeting, and end on what is now a pretty cheap cliffhanger. Might be the worst ending considering all the other endings on this list, but for 2006, this was a fine ending for an episode of television. If you haven't seen Heroes, I highly recommend it. So those are my top 8 favorite pilot episodes in TV shows. Now I know I probably didn't cover everybody's favorite, so again, feel free to let me know in the comments what your favorite pilot episode is, and try to keep it spoiler free, because if it's good enough for me or for anybody else, we might even give it a watch. And again, special thanks to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe for more stuff like this. Special thanks to all my channel members, and I'll see you all in the next one.